The History of Everything You Use, Episode 6. Spices, the flavours worth dying for. Opening. Welcome back. Tonight we continue our slow journey through the histories of the ordinary things that fill our days. The objects and substances so familiar to us that they have become almost invisible. We have followed salt, coffee, sugar, bread, and tea. Tonight, we turn to a handful of small, dried objects that change the world more, perhaps, than any commodity we have discussed so far. Small, fragrant, and once nearly beyond price, they drew ships across unknown oceans, redrew the map of the world, ended some civilizations and created others, and made a few small islands in a distant sea into the most strategically important real estate on Earth. They sit today in your kitchen cupboard, in small glass jars with modest paper labels. A pinch of black pepper, a few sticks of cinnamon, a single nutmeg, a pair of dark, nail-shaped cloves. Each of them, at various moments in history, has been worth its weight in gold. Wars have been fought over them. Continents have been discovered by mistake in the search for them. The world we live in ways most people never quite notice, was shaped by the desire for these dried fragments of tropical plants. Tonight, we are going to talk about spices. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift back with mine. Through caravans of camels crossing endless deserts, through Venetian galleys and Portuguese carracks, and Dutch East India men crossing storm-lashed oceans, through fabulous fortunes made and ancient kingdoms destroyed, to a time when a small ceramic jar of ground pepper was one of the most precious things a European home could contain. Part 1. Why spices matter. Before we begin the story, we should ask a simple question. Why did spices matter so much? Why were people willing to sail into unknown seas, to die of scurvy on months-long voyages, to slaughter and be slaughtered for a few dried buds and barks and seeds? Some of the reasons are obvious. Spices tasted extraordinary. In a European diet that, for most people, was based on grain, salted meat, root vegetables, and whatever local flavours happened to be available, the first taste of black pepper or cinnamon or clove must have been a revelation. Spices woke up food. They transformed it. Some of the reasons were practical, though later historians have sometimes exaggerated this point. For a long time, historians repeated that spices were prized in medieval Europe because they masked the taste of spoiled meat. This is largely a myth. Only the wealthy could afford both meat and spices in significant quantities, and the wealthy could also afford fresh meat. If your food was spoiled, you did not eat it. You were not desperate enough for spices to have your money for them. But spices did preserve food, up to a point, and they did make salted or dried meat, which was the winter reality for most people who could afford meat at all, more pleasant to eat. Some of the reasons were medical. Medieval physicians, working with the Galenic theory we discussed in the sugar episode, prescribed spices for an enormous range of ailments. Cinnamon was warming and drying. Pepper stimulated the digestion. Cloves treated toothache. Nutmeg was, at various times, thought to prevent the plague, to induce sleep, and to sharpen the mind. But perhaps the deepest reason was social. To possess spices was to display, in the most direct sensory way, that you had access to the far ends of the earth. A wealthy medieval household that could season its dishes with pepper and cinnamon and cloves was announcing, with every meal, that its money and its trade connections reached across half the world. Spices were, in effect, edible geography. A sprinkle of cinnamon on a dish was a public declaration that this cook, this master, this family could touch the mysterious East. And this brings us to the strange geography of spices itself. Because unlike almost any other precious commodity, spices came, for most of history, from a very small number of very specific places. Places most Europeans knew of only by rumour and could not have found on any map. Part 2. The Spice Islands. The three greatest, most prized, most expensive spices of the medieval world were pepper, cloves, and nutmeg. And each of them, until modern times, grew in essentially one place on Earth. Black pepper, the peppercorn, is the small dried berry of a climbing vine, Piper nigrum. It is native to the Malabar coast of southwestern India, along a strip of green tropical hills that faces the Arabian Sea. For most of history, Indian pepper was the pepper of the world. It reached the Mediterranean through Arab traders who carried it up the Red Sea to Egypt, or through Persian merchants who moved it overland by caravan. Cloves and nutmeg are far stranger stories. Both are native to a tiny cluster of volcanic islands in the eastern Indonesian archipelago, called the Maluku Islands, known to European traders for centuries as the Spice Islands, or more evocatively, the Moluccas. Cloves, the dried flower buds of the tree Syzygium aromaticum, grew until European ships arrived on essentially 5 small volcanic islands: Ternate, Tidor, Motir, Makian, and Bacan. These islands together form a small chain of active volcanoes rising out of the sea, none of them larger than a modest county. For centuries, every clove in the world came from these 5 islands, nowhere else. Nutmeg is even more extreme. The nutmeg tree, Myristica fragrans, produces both nutmeg, the hard inner seed, and mace, the red web that surrounds it. Both were prized, and until Dutch merchants successfully spread the tree elsewhere in the 18th and 19th centuries, the nutmeg tree grew in exactly one place on Earth: the tiny Banda Islands, a cluster of 10 small volcanic specks in the Banda Sea, several days' sail south of the Clove Islands. The total land area of the Banda Islands is less than 60 square kilometres. All of the world's nutmeg, all of history's nutmeg, until relatively recently, came from a place smaller than many European cities. Think about what this means. A European cook adding a scrape of nutmeg to a rice pudding in 1500 was seasoning her meal with a substance that had come from an island most of her countrymen had never heard of, an island whose inhabitants had never heard of her, an island that appeared on no European map. Behind that pinch of spice lay a chain of merchants, Bandanese seafarers to Javanese and Malay traders, to Muslim merchants in Malacca, to Gujarati traders across the Indian Ocean, to Arab caravaneers up the Red Sea, to Egyptian middlemen in Cairo and Alexandria, to Venetian and Genoese galleys across the Mediterranean, and finally to the marketplaces of Venice, Bruges, and London. Each hand along the chain took its cut, and by the time the nutmeg reached Europe, it might sell for hundreds of times what it had been worth on the beach in Banda. For centuries, no European even knew where the Spice Islands were. It was a secret that Arab and Indian merchants had every reason to keep hidden. When Marco Polo, in the late 13th century, published his account of his travels through Asia, he was one of the first Europeans to give even a vague description of the origin of these spices. And his account was so remarkable that it inspired a class of Europeans who would spend the next 2 centuries dreaming of one thing: how to reach the Spice Islands directly, cut out every middleman, and become impossibly rich. Part 3. Ancient Roads of Flavour. Spices had been travelling long before Marco Polo, of course. The ancient world had already built vast trade routes to move them. Egyptian mummies from thousands of years BC were embalmed with cassia and cinnamon, substances that must have travelled from somewhere in East Africa, or perhaps as far as Sri Lanka. The Egyptians never told, or perhaps never knew, quite where these barks came from. When Greek and Roman writers asked, they were told stories that cinnamon grew in impossible marshes guarded by great birds, that it was harvested by clever tricks involving lumps of meat and mountain nests. These stories, we now suspect, were deliberate misinformation, spread by Arab traders to protect their monopoly. Rome, in particular, developed a passionate appetite for spices. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, complained that Rome was hemorrhaging vast sums of gold and silver each year to India and Arabia to pay for pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and other exotic goods. He estimated the drain at 50 million sesterces annually, a colossal figure, and probably a real one. The Romans traded so extensively with India that hordes of Roman coins have been dug up in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, thousands of them, mostly from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. A Roman cookbook, attributed to Apicius, contains recipes with pepper as the dominant seasoning in dish after dish. The routes these spices travelled were complex, layered, and remarkably durable. There was a sea route. From the Indian coast, monsoon winds carried Arab and Indian dhows across the Arabian Sea to Aden and the ports of the Red Sea, from which caravans moved goods overland to the Mediterranean. There was a land route. Caravans winding through Persia, Mesopotamia, and Central Asia, parts of the network that later Europeans would romanticize as the Silk Road, though it carried far more than silk. And there was a network of intermediate hubs: Alexandria in Egypt, Aleppo in Syria, Constantinople on the Bosphorus, where goods changed hands, prices were negotiated, and taxes were levied by whichever ruler currently controlled the route. Whoever controlled the spice routes grew rich. Whoever taxed them grew richer still. And when, in the 15th century, control of the Eastern Mediterranean shifted decisively to the Ottoman Empire, after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, European merchants suddenly found their access to Eastern spices choked by Ottoman middlemen who could set any price they wished. This was the moment that broke everything open, because Europeans, now cut off from a trade they could not do without, made an audacious decision. If they could not go east through the Ottomans, they would go around them. They would find a sea route to India. Part 4. The Age of Discovery, which was really the Age of Spices. We were taught in school that a series of great European explorers set out in the late 15th and early 16th centuries to discover the wider world. This is not quite right. Almost every one of them set out with a very specific, practical goal in mind. They were not searching for knowledge. They were searching for spices. Christopher Columbus, sailing west from Spain in 1492, believed he was sailing to India by a shorter route than the eastward Portuguese one. His expedition's investors expected pepper. When he reached the Caribbean, he genuinely thought he had arrived in the Indies, which is why the peoples he encountered came to be called Indians, why the Caribbean islands became the West Indies, and why a spicy chili pepper found in the New World was misleadingly named pepper, after the entirely different plant Columbus had actually been looking for. On his return, he brought back samples of American peppers and insisted they were as good as the Indian kind. The Spanish court was disappointed. Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese captain, set out in 1497 with the harder and ultimately more successful mission to sail around the entire African continent and reach India directly. He rounded the Cape of Good Hope, crossed the Indian Ocean with the help of an Arab pilot, and in May 1498 anchored off Calicut on the Malabar coast. When Indian officials asked what he had come for, one of his men gave the famous answer: Christians and spices. The Portuguese now had a direct route to the source of pepper. Within a couple of decades, Portuguese fleets were pushing further east. In 1511, they seized Malacca, the great Muslim trading city that controlled the strait between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. From Malacca, Portuguese captains sailed on and reached, at last, the fabled Spice Islands themselves. They set up fortified trading posts on Ternate and Tidore. For nearly a century, Portugal held a rough monopoly on the direct European spice trade, and the country grew astonishingly wealthy on the proceeds. Lisbon became one of the great cities of Europe. The riches of the Malabar and the Moluccas paid for its churches and palaces. Meanwhile, Ferdinand Magellan, sailing under the Spanish flag in 1519, tried to reach the same Spice Islands by going west, around the tip of South America. Magellan himself died in a skirmish in the Philippines, but a handful of his men, in a single battered ship, completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. A voyage undertaken at bottom not to prove that the world was round, which educated Europeans already knew, but to reach the nutmeg trees of Banda. When that lone ship, the Victoria, limped back into Seville in 1522, its cargo of Moluccan cloves was so valuable that it paid for the entire expedition, even though every other ship had been lost. The Age of Discovery, as it is called in Western history books, was in a great many respects the age of the spice trade. Part 5. The Dutch take the islands. In the late 16th century, everything shifted again. The Dutch Republic, newly independent and driven by a hungry commercial class, entered the Eastern trade. In 1602, the Dutch chartered the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. It was one of the first modern joint stock corporations, and it was granted extraordinary powers to raise armies, to wage wars, to negotiate treaties, to build fortresses, to hang and behead. It was, in effect, a private country with a fleet. The VOC's overriding strategy was clear. Portugal had settled for controlling the trade. The Dutch would control the source. And so, over the 17th century, the VOC systematically seized the Spice Islands. They took Ambon in 1605. They fought and defeated the Portuguese at Ternate. They negotiated, cajoled, threatened, and finally attacked their way into total control of the clove trade. From 1652 onward, they enforced a policy of concentrating clove cultivation on Ambon alone, and destroying clove trees on every other island in the Moluccas. Local populations who had grown cloves for centuries were forbidden on pain of death to keep the trees. Dutch expeditions periodically burned any clove trees found outside authorized plantations. The VOC controlled global clove supply the way a monopoly controls a factory. And this brings us to the darkest chapter in the whole spice story. What happened at Banda? Part 6. The Nutmeg Massacre. The nutmeg trees of the Banda Islands had, for centuries, been tended by the Bandanese, a seafaring people with their own language, their own governance, their own trading networks reaching to Java and beyond. When the Dutch first arrived in the early 17th century, they demanded that the Bandanese sell nutmeg only to the VOC, at prices the VOC set. The Bandanese, who had traded with many other buyers for generations, saw no reason to accept. Fighting broke out on and off for years. In 1621, the VOC Governor-General, Jan Pieterszoon Koen, a name that Dutch schoolchildren once learned as a great hero and that today is being reconsidered, decided to end the dispute permanently. He arrived at Banda with a fleet, marines, and a company of Japanese mercenary swordsmen. In the campaign that followed, the Bandanese population was almost annihilated. Estimates vary, but of a pre-invasion population of perhaps 15,000 people, perhaps only about 1,000 survived on the islands. Some were killed in the fighting. Some were tortured and executed. Many died of starvation or on forced marches. Others were transported as slaves to work elsewhere in the Dutch Empire. The Bandanese as a people were, in the space of a few months, effectively destroyed. In their place, the Dutch imported enslaved and indentured workers to tend the nutmeg trees, under the supervision of Dutch plantation owners called perkeniers. The Banda Islands became a plantation colony, producing nutmeg for the world market, run by outsiders on the graves of the people who had first made nutmeg valuable.
This is not a footnote to the spice story, it is a central event. Every jar of nutmeg sold in Europe for the next 200 years came from this system. And every time we have discussed the human cost of ordinary commodities in this series, the sugar of the Caribbean, the coffee of Saint-Domingue, the tea of Assam, we have been circling around the same fundamental pattern. But nowhere was that pattern applied with more concentrated, deliberate violence than on the tiny Banda Islands. Part 7. An Island for an Island. There is a famous story about Banda that is often told for its surprising ending, and it is worth telling here, not just because it is amazing, but because it captures how immensely valuable these tiny islands seemed to Europeans at the time. One small island in the Banda group called Run, a place little more than 3 kilometers long, ringed with coconut trees, had been claimed by English merchants in 1616. For decades, the English and Dutch had fought bitterly over it. Run was tiny, but it had nutmeg trees, and while the English held it, the Dutch nutmeg monopoly was incomplete. In 1667, after another Anglo-Dutch war, the two nations negotiated the Treaty of Breda. Under its terms, they agreed to swap 2 of their contested overseas holdings. The Dutch, at last, would take Run and complete their monopoly of the nutmeg trade. In exchange, the English would take a small island in North America that the Dutch had held for decades. An island the Dutch called New Amsterdam, and that the English promptly renamed New York. Try to hold that in your mind. In 1667, a Dutch merchant would happily have traded Manhattan, without a moment's hesitation, for 3 kilometers of nutmeg trees. From the perspective of the 17th century, this was not the strange choice it seems today. It was arithmetic. Nutmeg was worth a fortune. New Amsterdam was a struggling fur trading post at the mouth of a river. If someone had told the negotiators at Breda that in 3 centuries the little island they were giving up would be the financial capital of the world, and Run would be a forgotten name on a map, they would have laughed. But that is what happened. And the lesson buried in this story is deep. What we treasure changes. What we build our economies around today may look, from a distance of centuries, as strange as trading Manhattan for nutmeg looks to us. Part 8. The Fall of the Spice Monopolies. Every monopoly has an ending, and the great Dutch spice monopolies fell in the 18th and 19th centuries, not to war, but to smuggling, botany, and eventually the free market. The first cracks came from the French. A French administrator named Pierre Poivre, his family name literally meant pepper, an accident of nomenclature almost too neat to believe, spent decades trying to break the Dutch monopoly. In the 1770s, he succeeded in smuggling nutmeg and clove seedlings out of the Moluccas and planting them on the French-controlled island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, and later on Réunion. From Mauritius, cloves and nutmeg spread to other tropical possessions. The British, when they briefly seized the Spice Islands during the Napoleonic Wars, deliberately smuggled clove trees to Zanzibar. Within a generation, Zanzibar was producing more cloves than the entire Moluccan chain. Meanwhile, the Dutch effort to enforce their monopoly by burning every unauthorized clove tree in the Moluccas had one unexpected long-term effect. It made the Bandanese and Moluccan populations, most of whom had lost the traditional roles that once tied them to the land, poorer and angrier. When the great Indonesian independence movement rose in the 20th century,
Some of its earliest, most bitter memories came from these very islands. As spices spread to new plantations across the tropics, their prices fell, sometimes catastrophically from the perspective of the old monopolists. By the mid-19th century, cloves and nutmeg were still expensive, but they were no longer astronomical. By the 20th century, they were affordable to almost any household. Today, you can walk into a supermarket in any city on Earth and buy, for the price of a cup of coffee, spices that were once worth their weight in gold. The whole ancient economy of scarcity was quietly dissolved by botany and by shipping. The plants had left the islands. Pepper's story is slightly different, but ends the same way. Indian pepper remained important, but Indonesia, Vietnam, and Brazil eventually became huge producers. Today, Vietnam alone produces roughly a third of the world's black pepper, a shift within just the last few decades. The great spice that once drained Roman treasuries is now, in most kitchens, taken so casually that we barely think about it as we grind the mill. Part 9. The World the Spices Made. Let us step back and consider what the spice trade did to the world, quite apart from the spices themselves. It shifted the world's economic centre of gravity, at least in Western history books, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Cities that had grown rich on medieval spice trade, Venice, Genoa, Alexandria, Cairo, declined. Cities that faced the ocean, Lisbon, Amsterdam, London, rose. It ceded the corporate form. The Dutch and English East India companies were among the earliest true joint stock corporations, and their techniques for raising capital, spreading risk, and coordinating enormous distant enterprises are the direct ancestors of the modern multinational company. It brought the first sustained European colonial presence to South and Southeast Asia, a presence that would grow over centuries into the vast colonial empires of the 19th century. The map of Asia today, its national borders, its official languages, its economic patterns, all bear traces of the search for pepper and clove and nutmeg.
And it accelerated a great mixing of foods and flavours between continents. Chili peppers, tomatoes, potatoes, corn, cocoa, and vanilla left the Americas in Portuguese and Spanish ships and reached Africa, Asia, and Europe. Ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg reached the Americas. Almost every national cuisine we now think of as distinctive, Italian tomato sauce, Indian curry with chili pepper, Thai food, Sichuan cooking with chili, was reshaped in the last few centuries by the great botanical exchange that the spice trade had begun. The kitchen you know today is not, in fact, an ancient thing. It is a product of 500 years of ships. And so we return, one more time, to the ordinary. To the small glass jar of spice that sits, right now, in your kitchen cupboard. It looks so unremarkable. A pinch of black pepper, a stick of cinnamon, a tiny brown nutmeg the size of a grape. But you know their secret now. You know that they began in a few very small places on Earth. The Malabar coast of India, the sisters of Ternate and Tidore, the tiny volcanic Banda Islands. You know that for millennia they travelled to your ancestors through chains of a dozen or more merchants, each taking a cut, each keeping the origin secret. You know that they made ancient empires rich and drained ancient treasuries. You know that Columbus set out because he was hunting for them, that he mistakenly named an entire people after his target, and that a fiery American plant was misnamed pepper after them by mistake. You know that Vasco da Gama went east and Magellan west, both for the same reason. You know that the Dutch traded Manhattan for a nutmeg island, and that they destroyed the Bandanese people to build the plantation that produced the nutmeg in your kitchen. You know that pepper today is grown in Vietnam, that cloves that once came from 5 islands now come from Zanzibar,
and that a substance once worth more than gold now sells for pennies. Spices teach us the strangest lesson of this series, that value is not intrinsic, it is invented. It is inflated by distance, by rarity, by mystery, and by the willingness of powerful men to fight over it. When those things fade, so does the value. Nutmeg is nutmeg, the same substance in 1500 and in 2026. What changed was us. The next time you grind a peppermill, or grate a nutmeg, or drop a clove into a warm drink, remember, for just a moment, the vast chain of ships and merchants and empires and violence that made these tiny objects reach you. You are holding fragments of one of the great transformative economies of world history. An economy that reshaped continents in a search for something that grew, once, only on a few small islands in a distant sea. Sleep well, and when we meet again, we will follow the story of another substance that shaped the modern world. The dark, complex, once sacred drink that filled the goblets of Aztec priests and the cups of Parisian ladies alike: chocolate. Until then, good night.